Um, so I'm Holly, the HabiMap Programme Officer at Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, and I'm joined today by my colleague Molly, the Senior GIS Specialist. And today we're going to talk about how data is collected and processed in HabiMap, which is Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust's programme to map and monitor habitats across Gloucestershire. So I'll start with some background on why Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust set up the HabiMap programme. In 2010, the Lawton Report was published. This was a review of England's wildlife sites and ecological networks commissioned by the UK government. It concluded that England's wildlife sites don't form a coherent network and called for conservation work to focus on increasing the size of wildlife sites, improving the quality of the habitat within them, and increasing connectivity between them. In response to this, DEFRA released their 25-year environment plan, which called for the creation of a national nature recovery network. This means a network of wildlife-rich places across the country to increase and restore nature. So in response to that, Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust led the production of a nature recovery network for the county. They used the best available habitat data from local and national data sets, including satellite mapping imagery. During this work, we found that some of the habitat data were either too old or inadequate, and so HabiMap was created as a project to ground truth habitat data and improve the local nature recovery network. So what is HabiMap? HabiMap is a citizen science programme which aims to carry out detailed habitat surveys on all land in the entire county of Gloucestershire. Ideally, this will be done on a rolling basis every 10 years. In this programme, we train volunteers on how to use the UK habitat classification system, which is referred to as UK Hab, to go out and survey habitats. Our volunteers record this data into the Survey 123 app on their phones when they're out in the field, and then we use the data they've collected to update the Nature Recovery Network map for Gloucestershire. There are 4 core elements to HabiMapping. Firstly, we need landholder permission, so we don't survey anyone's land without making sure it's okay with them. So we reach out to landholders and ask them to be involved in the programme. Those who sign up will get a free report in return showing the types of habitat on their land. Secondly, we need volunteers to help us do the surveys. So we recruit and train volunteers to go out and HabiMap people's land. Once volunteers are trained, they get access to our site selection form on the Survey 123 app, where they can select what land parcels they want to go and survey, so hopefully those nearby to them. When they select a site, we send them the relevant contact details for the landholder so that they can arrange a survey when it suits them. And we also send them a pre-survey map, which is a map of the site containing the OS master map polygons and what the current nature recovery network predicts that they will find there in terms of habitat. Next, we have data collection. So volunteers go out and do the survey itself in the spring and summer from April to September. While on survey, our volunteers record the data into the app on their phones, and after the field season is over, we process the data in QGIS, which is a mapping software, and we send reports to the landholders to show them what habitats we found on their land. And then finally, this data is used to update the Nature Recovery Network, which Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust staff use, especially those in farm advisory and planning. So a quick slide about volunteer training. The volunteer training is quite comprehensive. They go through a several-stage training process to train people to use the UK Hab classification system, UK Habitat classification system. Firstly, there are online presentations to go through the basics of how the system works, and then we also have field training sessions to put it into practice and learn some botanical ID skills. After the training is complete, volunteers take a quiz on their botanical ID skills to give them a level, and this level helps when arranging surveys so that the most experienced botanists can go out with new volunteers, and new volunteers can develop their ID skills and HabiMap skills. So how are habitats classified? Habitats are underpinned by vegetation type, geology, geographic context, and hydrology. Classifying habitats makes it easier to record the extent of habitats and to assess their change over time. Although we put habitats into categories, no example of the same habitats are identical. Classifying habitats is about describing points on a continuum. So this is a little bit about the UK Habitat Classification System, UK Hab, to show you how it works. The system consists of hierarchical primary codes, for example, G2A, which means lowland calcareous grassland, and then a list of secondary codes, for example, scattered scrub or veteran trees, and these are used to classify and record details of habitat. So you can see this example of a site where the primary code is modified grassland, and then it has a number of secondary codes that describe the extra detail. The primary habitat codes are hierarchical, and this is the system it uses. So a level 1 primary code is just the really basic major ecosystems. It's the area terrestrial, freshwater, or coastal. Level 2 codes are covering ecosystem types, so grassland, woodland, cropland, wetland, urban areas, and there are more. Level 3 is split into 20 broad habitat types, for example, acidic grassland, neutral grassland, or calcareous grassland, deciduous or coniferous woodland. We ask all our HabiMapping recording to get to at least this level, ideally. Level 4 describes habitats in even more detail. For example, instead of just being calcareous grassland, does the site meet the criteria for lowland calcareous grassland or other calcareous grassland? And then finally, we have level 5, which is the most detailed category. Examples include things like Holcus-Juncus neutral grassland or beech forest on acid soil. And it's not always possible to get every habitat to this level, particularly grasslands, which may not exactly fit any of the descriptors. So at level 2, these are the 9 ecosystem types: grassland, woodland, heathland, wetland, cropland, urban, sparsely vegetated land, and rivers and lakes. I'm going to give an example of how the breakdown into levels 3, 4, and 5 works for grassland next. So you can see the level 2 code is G for grassland, and then the level 3 codes are split into 4 at this level. Acid, calcareous, neutral, or modified. Modified grassland is species-poor grassland, often found in areas like urban parks and intensively managed farms. It's dominated by plants like ryegrass and white clover. The other 3 grassland types are determined by the underlying geology of the area, so it can be helpful for our volunteers to consult geology maps along with looking at the indicated species present on site when they're making the classification. In Gloucestershire, acid grassland is mostly found in the Forest of Dean. Calcareous grassland is found really frequently in the Cotswolds, and neutral grasslands are very common across the county. In the field, we have a UK Hab guidebook which we use, and this has descriptions of the details of each of these sites and how to know if you're in one based on the species that are present and things like their frequency and how much of the land they cover. Here's another breakdown for the rivers and lakes category. So rivers and lakes are split into 2 categories at level 3 to show standing water and flowing water. And then level 4 categories largely talk about whether water is eutrophic, which is nutrient rich, or mesotrophic, which is nutrient poor. And in Gloucestershire, we'll mostly come across eutrophic water bodies. Next, we have indicator species, which are what we look for in the field to determine what habitat type the land falls into. The UK Hab guidebook, which there's a screenshot of there, specifies which indicator species to look for and what species and frequency you need to meet a certain classification criteria. So, for example, for a site to be lowland calcareous grassland, it needs more than 2 of the indicated species listed on this page to be frequent on the DAFO scale, as well as more than 3 of them to be occasional. The list of grassland indicated species are quite long, but here are just a few of them. For calcareous grassland, we have things like wild thyme, rock rose, and salad bonnet. For acid grassland, we have heath bedstraw, Tormund hill, and wavy hairgrass. For neutral grassland, we're likely to see perennial ryegrass, crested dogtail, and black knapweed. And in modified grassland, you're also likely to see perennial ryegrass, as well as cocksfoot and white clover. So we've just been through a lot of detail about the primary code. UK Hab also then has secondary codes which add extra detail on top of the primary code. So you can only have 1 primary code, but you can have as many secondary codes needed to describe the site. So secondary codes are non-hierarchical, and they provide information on environment, management, and origin, and the presence or absence of features in a polygon. And there's a list of essential secondary codes which you must record if they're present on a site, and additional secondary codes. These are some examples of what's found in each secondary code category. So for essential codes, we have things like scattered overlying vegetation, which can describe habitat mosaics. For example, scattered scrub, scattered bracken, scattered trees, and scattered rushes. Then we have codes to describe habitat complexes, for example, traditional orchard and wood pasture and parkland. I'll show you an example of them next. Other codes describe extra habitat features, like veteran trees and tall forbs. And there's also a secondary code for ancient woodland site, which is something we determine in field by looking for the presence of indicated plants. And then we also have additional secondary codes. These describe things like the site management, whether it's cattle grazed, sheep grazed, or maybe a plantation. They can also describe the growth or stage of the habitat. So there are codes such as young trees planted or young trees self-set and bare ground. They can also show things like soil moisture, so mesic, wet, or seasonally wet. So here's an example of how habitat mosaic can be described using secondary codes. Both of these examples are described by their secondary codes as well as the primary code, which could be botanically interesting grassland, modified grassland, or even arable as the ground cover. And now I'll explain some other survey rules before I show you how our volunteers go about surveying a site in the field. So firstly, I'm going to talk about what a polygon is in the HabiMapping context, as I use it a lot. So a polygon is a parcel of land that is categorized as being of the same habitat type, i.e. it has one primary code. When making the nature recovery network, we used OS master map polygons to form the outline of the county habitat map. But these do not always align with the habitat categories on the ground. On the ground, we check whether the polygons on the pre-survey map, so the OS master map polygons, actually do contain the same habitat type. And if not, we split them up or we merge them or we redraw the shapes. For a polygon to get a different primary code, it needs to have a change of habitat of scale greater than the minimum mappable unit. The minimum mappable unit sets out the minimum area of habitat that can be mapped as a polygon. We've chosen a standard MMU for HabiMap, which is an area of 400 meters squared or more. This is equivalent of 20 by 20 meters, equivalent to 20 by 20 meters, and it can help to think of it like that in the field, but really it can be a different shape. And if it's a different shape, then it needs to have a minimum of 5 meters on its smallest side. The exception to this is wet features, so ponds, wet ditches, and springs can be mapped no matter what size they are. When our volunteers get to a site, they'll start by carrying out a structured walk around the polygon. We recommend a W-shaped walk through grassland, stopping at regular intervals to assess whether indicator species are rare, occasional, or frequent on the daffodil scale. For most grassland, stopping 10 times to look at the vegetation within the square meter in front of you will be enough to classify the habitat. This is an example of a site and its UK Hab categories. This site has been split into 3 different polygons with the 3 different primary codes present. So on the right, we have beech forest on neutral to rich soils, and the secondary codes show ancient woodland site, semi-natural woodland, and high forest. In the middle, we have the margin of this arable field, which has the primary code, arable field margins, key. The secondary codes add the extra detail. They say ruderal or ephemeral, bare ground, and under active management. And then on the right, we have the arable field itself, which has the primary code C1, arable and horticulture. And there's no further detail provided than this. We like to get down to level 3, 4, or 5 code, but in this case, we can't see what's growing, so it has to stay at level 2. And then it's got secondary codes again for bare ground, active management, and ploughed. So now I'm going to walk you through an example of how a survey might be done in the field. The volunteers enter these woodlands near the south of Gloucestershire. The first thing really is to start at looking at the trees to identify the primary code. So they do a good walk around, and these are the most common species coming up. We've got hazel, small-leaved lime, field maple, dogwood, and pedunculate oak. So the next thing then is to open up the HabiMap guidebook and start looking through the definition. This table is not the guidebook, it's a simplified version, but it illustrates the process. So they've identified it as woodland and forest because the land contains more than 25% cover of trees. Then more than 80% of the trees are broadleaved, and so it fits broadleaf forest rather than coniferous. So the trees have wide leaves rather than needles. So they choose W1. Next, it gets a bit more tricky, and the tree species classification comes into use. So going down the list, it doesn't have the correct species to be upland oakwood or upland mixed ashwoods. Lowland beech and yew woodland is dominated by those species, which is not the case here. Wet woodland is dominated by wet living species like willow and alder, which again is not the case here. They're not present in high enough numbers. And then finally, W1F covers a wide range of species, and it's described as the code for most established semi-natural woodland in the UK, and our woodland fits here. In terms of level 5 code, in HabiMap, we've taken out the codes that don't apply to Gloucestershire. So there's only 3 level 5 codes for W1F. W1F 5, 6, and 7. W1F 5 and 6 do not occur in Gloucestershire, and therefore W1F 7, the description says woodland that doesn't fit W1F 5 or 6, and therefore it must be that one. This part will be more complicated for other habitat types. Then we start thinking about secondary codes. So back to that first photo, there's a track running through the forest wide enough for a car to fit down. So that fits the definition of track as a secondary code. Looking around, there are also coppice trees, which gives secondary code coppice. If there are non-coppice trees around as well, it can become coppice with standards, standards being the trees in between the coppiced ones that are not cut. And then finally, looking at the ground flora, we can see wood anemone, English bluebells, and wild garlic. These are indicator species suggesting that the site is an ancient woodland. And if you Google the history of the site as well, it confirms it's the largest ancient woodland in the southwest, and so we choose ancient woodland site. You can also check things like DEFRA Magic Map to look at records of ancient woodland. So to summarise that, this is the final UK Hab classification for this site. Other lowland mixed deciduous woodland is the primary code, and then the secondary codes are for ancient woodland site, coppice with standard, track, semi-natural woodland, which is as opposed to plantation, and long continuity habitat, which is that which has been managed in the same way since 1893 for woodlands. For grasslands, it's the year 1936. So surveyors record this data on HabiMap survey form on the Survey 123 app. The form asks for details such as their surveyor code, the date, the primary code of the habitat, and the secondary codes that are applicable. And this information is attached to the polygon that they draw on the map. The first picture here on the left shows the pre-survey map we send to volunteers before they go out to a site, dividing it into the expected polygons and the expected habitats based on the nature recovery network. The red line is the site boundary. The second picture shows a screenshot of the polygons that the volunteers have drawn in yellow on the app during a survey for that site, and how they do not follow the polygons that they were predicted to. And now I'll hand over to Molly.
Thank you, Holly. So yeah, I'm Molly, and I'm the Senior GIS Specialist for the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust and the Centre for Environmental Records for Gloucestershire. So I'm now going to take you through in a bit more detail how we go and process all of the survey data back in the office. So once our HabiMap volunteers and programme staff have completed surveying a whole site and made sure that all of their Survey 123 forms have been submitted back to the ArcGIS online cloud, we can start to download that data and process it. So Holly has talked us through the survey process, which gets us from the first image on the left to the middle image on the screen. And I'm now going to focus on how we get from that middle image, which is the sort of raw survey data, to the image on the right, which is the sort of final results post-survey habitat map. So this year, our surveyors have submitted over 1,500 surveys, meaning that over 1,500 habitat parcels have been recorded throughout Gloucestershire just this year. So each of these surveys are processed using GIS, which stands for Geographic Information System, and it's essentially a computer program which allows you to view, create, and analyse spatial data. So as you can imagine, this is a lot of data to process. So to tackle this challenge, we have a team of data processors. And this team is made up of the main HabiMap team. So that's Holly, our HabiMap intern and our HabiMap trainee, as well as myself in the GIS team and our part-time GIS officer. So the GIS software that we use to process the survey data is called QGIS or QGIS. QGIS is a free open source GIS application that lets you create, edit, analyze, and map spatial data. It supports many different file formats and runs on all major platforms, and it's widely used by professionals and researchers for anything from map making to complex geospatial analysis. The HabiMap survey data then is downloaded from Survey 123. We clean it up a little bit using a Python script, which is like a computer program coding sort of script. And then we load it into QGIS for a bit more in-depth processing. So as you can see on this slide here, we start with a satellite base map, such as the Esri satellite base map. And we overlay our site boundary, which is shown in the yellow line. So the satellite map is really helpful because it will indicate in some instances where the different habitat parcels are. For example, they can often clearly show the boundary between, for example, an area of woodland and an area of grassland. Sometimes they can even show the boundaries between different grassland habitats or habitats, in the same sort of broad category. So, for example, modified grassland often shows as a brighter, sort of richer green because it's got all those nutrients in it. Whereas kind of less nutrient-rich grasslands, things like calcareous grassland, generally tend to show as a bit more of a fainter, maybe more yellowish kind of colour. However, it's really important to note that we can't accurately map the habitats using the satellite imagery alone. The satellite imagery doesn't allow us to see things like individual species to accurately infer the habitat type, and it doesn't always clearly show where one habitat ends and another begins. Sometimes it's a bit, blurred. So it also doesn't give us a full sense of which secondary codes should be applied to that habitat parcel. So to map the habitats as accurately as possible, we do need to survey the sites in person, which is why the HabiMap programme is so important. So as Holly briefly mentioned earlier, we also use OS master map data to help us with the processing. OS master map is the most detailed and accurate mapping data for Great Britain, created by Ordnance Survey. It covers every feature larger than a few meters, including buildings, paths, rivers, fields, and natural environments. So it's shown here on the screen with by the bright blue lines, and you can see how it's dividing up the land into kind of general land cover types, such as grassland and woodland. Sometimes the OS master map shapes accurately reflect the shapes of the habitats that the surveyors find on the ground and draw into their survey. So we can use the boundaries of the OS master map in these cases to represent the boundaries of the habitats in our final results. But other times the habitats on the ground don't match the OS master map data. So in this slide now, you can see the HabiMap survey data is layered over the top of the OS master map data. So these big yellow blobs are the downloaded Survey 123 data. So you can see that the survey drawings are actually quite different to the OS master map data. This is because the HabiMap survey is capturing habitat data at a greater level of detail than what the OS master map data is. It's capturing things like different kinds of grasslands, not just grass, and different types of woodland and pockets of scrub, not just trees. So we use the digitizing tools in QGIS, such as splitting and merging, to edit the OS master map shapes, using the survey information as well as satellite imagery as guides, so that the results accurately represent the shape and extent of the habitats on the ground. So for this site, as an example, this is what the data looked like before HabiMap. So you can see that the habitat types are mapped quite generally, or the shapes are mapped quite generally, and the information, hasn't been ground truthed, at least not recently. So we're lacking detail, precision, and accuracy. But this is what it looks like after HabiMap. So if we flick just back and forth between these two slides, you can start to see that we now have precisely mapped habitats at a much greater level of detail. And we know that this habitat data is up to date and reliable. So what do we do next with the data once it's been collected and cleaned up and processed? Well, there are a number of really, really important ways in which we use the HabiMap data. So one of the first things that we do is we provide our nature reserve condition monitoring team with the mapped results. So HabiMap provides us with baseline habitat data for our reserves, and with time it will show us if and how our habitats are changing. So in turn, our land managers and our reserve managers can use this data to inform their management decisions, as it helps them to understand exactly what habitats we have and where. We generate reports for landowners of sort of non-GWT Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust owned sites, as Holly mentioned earlier. And these reports include habitat maps, summary statistics, and a list of all the secondary code features that apply to each habitat parcel on their land. So sharing the results with landowners can aid in their management decisions. It provides them with the evidence they might need for things like stewardship applications or biodiversity net gain applications, and it can help them to target any restoration efforts. So for all of our report maps, we use the UK Hab symbology. So as Holly mentioned earlier, each habitat is assigned a primary habitat code using the UK Hab's classification system. And in the mapping, each primary habitat code is assigned a unique symbol. So you can see an example of some of the symbols here on the screen. The symbols are bold and colourful in order to aid visual representation, making it easier to identify each different habitat type in the map. So here's an example of what the final results might look like. So as you can see, this site contains 3 different grassland types. So we've got in the key over on the right, we've got G2C, which is other calcareous grassland, G3C, which is other neutral grassland, and G3C5, which is Aranatherum neutral grassland. We've also got 4 different woodland types. So we've got wet woodland, alder woodland on floodplains, lowland mixed deciduous woodland, and other lowland mixed deciduous woodland. And we've also got a bit of bramble scrub and some lowland fens. So as you can see, these habitats, the habitats belonging to the same sort of broad category like grassland or woodland, follow the same kind of colour theme in the map symbology. But within that theme, each individual primary code then has its own unique symbol. So things like lines, the direction of the lines, the thickness, it might have dots or hashing. So for example, you can see that all the grassland habitats kind of follow the lighter greens kind of colour theming, whereas woodland habitats follow a sort of darker greens and browns kind of theme. Heathland and scrub follow kind of purples, and wetland habitats are along the kind of pinks sorts of colours. If we try to realistically represent these types of habitats in the map by, using realistic colouring, it would be very difficult to distinguish between them. But using the bright, bold symbols makes it easy to pick them out and see the boundaries between them on the map. So just to illustrate again the importance of HabiMap data and the HabiMap programme for providing us with accurate and detailed habitat data, here's a view of what the open source and OS master map data would have looked like before the site was HabiMapped. This time we've symbolised it to give the different habitat categories colours. So again, you can see that we've now got, if we flick back and forth between these slides, we've now got a much more detailed digital representation of the habitats on this site than what we had before. So a few other uses. We use the species data gathered as part of the survey to feed into the Gloucestershire Centre for Environmental Records, or GESA, database. So this data then is used to inform commercial data searches for things like developments and planning. And it's also provided to our land management teams to provide them with evidence to help inform their management decisions. Recently, GISA took part in the Natural England Ancient Woodland Inventory Update project. And as part of the work for this project, we used ancient woodland indicator evidence gathered by our HabiMaps as part of the survey to help us to decide whether land should be included in the updated ancient woodland indicator dataset or not. This ancient woodland indicator dataset is going to be publicly available once it's published and will influence land management decisions across the county. And finally, as Holly touched on earlier, one of the most significant ways in which we use HabiMap data is in the creation of our nature recovery network for Gloucestershire. So the HabiMap data is used to help to create a full coverage habitat layer for Gloucestershire, which is a spatial data set that divides the entire county up into habitat types. And this data set is a key component in the generation of the nature recovery network. So the Nature Recovery Network maps habitat connectivity and nature restoration opportunities across the county. And this mapping underpins the local nature recovery strategy, which will be used by planners and stakeholders and decision makers across the county to identify zones of best opportunity for habitat creation or management. So with HabiMap, we're able to generate high quality, reliable habitat data. And the higher quality the data, the more reliable the nature recovery network will be. So better, more informed decisions can be made and outcomes for nature will be better. So this data really goes a long way, the data that our volunteers are collecting, and we really wouldn't be able to gather it without the dedication of our volunteers. Back to you, Hol.
Great, thank you. So here's just a little slide for if you were inspired by this and would like to get involved as a HabiMap volunteer yourself. We have a two-part training programme online and in the field. We ask for 5 or more days per year, which can be arranged whenever you like, including on weekends. Survey season is April to October. The HabiMap group has monthly bulletins and online meetings, a shared Google Drive of resources, an active WhatsApp for arranging surveys, and we also run things like Blitz days, which are where we go out with volunteers and staff together to a Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust nature reserve and HabiMap them. And botanical ID course is subject to funding, where you can learn more about particular species groups and how to ID them. And there's a QR code if you are interested. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and we will take any questions.